This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio, and it's Threatening Thursday, which means I'm joined by my European co-host, Oliver Neville, who is joining us electronically from the United Kingdom. We're talking about things going on in Europe, and we're going to talk next about penny ante tax avoidance. Now, Ollie, you're going to have to help me just a bit. David Gauck is noted as the Exchequer Secretary. Is that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, or is that a subordinate position?
It's not the Chancellor. It's a subordinate position within the Treasury area. So he's significant, but he's not the top guy.
Okay, so he would be sort of like the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, let's say. Something. Yeah,
I think you could compare that, yeah.
Okay, well, anyway, David Gauck, the Exchequer Secretary, claimed that making small cash payments to cleaners and tradesmen was as bad as tax avoidance, which ministers have already called morally repugnant. He spoke out as he gave a speech outlining plans to name and shame those who engage in aggressive tax avoidance schemes to avoid paying their fair share. Now, again, I want to translate from English to American. Scheme in American usually means something crooked. It can often, in British English, correct me if I'm wrong, Ollie, simply mean a plan, correct?
Absolutely. That's
okay.
Correct.
So under the new rules, celebrities and millionaires who use these tax avoidance plans will see their details passed to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Doesn't mean they're going to have to be taxed. It's just pay taxes because of the schemes or the plans are legal. They're not going to get any more tax money, but they're still going to try to beat them up in public. But what's really insulting is that Mr. Gauck has raised the eyebrows by suggesting that pensioners and families who pay cash to a cleaner, a plumber, or a gardener are just as bad as some super rich guy who's avoiding paying taxes on tens or hundreds of millions of pounds, dollars, euros, Swiss francs, or whatever. He said, quote, "Getting a discount with your plumber by paying cash in hand is something that is a big cost to the revenue and means others must pay more in tax," unquote. What do you think?
I think it's quite disgusting that he suggested that in a recession when people are trying to save money, that it's morally wrong to pay less, to pay someone cash in hand. A few pounds here and there, paying a plumber or someone who's mown your lawn is morally wrong. It just seems ridiculous that they're doing something that is perfectly legal, that they're not avoiding. It's not even the aggressive tax avoidance that the government seems to hate, which is also legal. It's just simply paying people in cash, and suddenly that's some sort of morally repugnant idea. And what is the great irony to this whole thing is that, as Guido Fawkes, the political blogger in the UK, has pointed out, this guy is actually worked at a top tax avoidance firm. He worked in McFarlane's as a solicitor with expertise on tax efficiency. So not only was he helping people avoid tax, he also claimed £10,000 worth of parliamentary expenses to avoid paying stamp duty and fees when he bought a house in London. So really, this guy hasn't only helped people avoid tax, he's avoided tax himself, and now he's trying to say that people who pay in cash are morally repugnant. You couldn't make it up. It's just completely, it's ridiculous. It's just typical hypocrisy from the Tories, and just shows how out of touch they are.
Do as I say, but not as I do. I guess the word repugnant on the graphic that we showed really should apply to Mr. Gauck and his fellow members of Parliament rather than to the people he's complaining about.
Oh, absolutely. He worked as a to help people tax avoid. His wife still works to help people avoid tax. Yet he seems to want to pick on the people in society who are the most vulnerable, who need to save money the most at these times when we've got an economic crisis caused by the government, caused by their sort of corporatist structure they have with the big banks. But it's those little guys that are suffering and will continue to suffer, but that they're trying to shame them into giving the government more money. You don't have to give the government more than you're legally obliged to.
Right, that's a rule of common law. It's also a rule that you are allowed to organize your finances legally in such a way as to minimize taxes.
Absolutely. It's simply like shopping around, going to different shops to buy the cheapest item. If you want to pay more tax, that's fine. You can voluntarily pay more tax, but for the government to say you morally should, even though you're not legally forced to, but you should be paying more tax to us because we want it, it's just a ridiculous claim to make. It's got no basis or no. It defies belief. When I first read this, I thought, what is this man talking about?
Well, it just shows that they are so committed to their idea that they're right and everyone else is wrong, and that they are above the law, that it's a government of men and not of laws, that they just show every day, and they want to control what everyone says and does. I mean, Margaret Thatcher said it. She said that socialism in government is not about equality, it's not about fairness, it's about control, and that's what this guy is about, is control.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's just sick.
Now, speaking about control, one of the places maybe there ought to be some control is our next story. The European Central Bank is printing money again. Big surprise. I think they're in a race with the Fed to see who can print the most paper before. Sometimes I think maybe we ought to invest in paper, just in paper manufacturing, because there's so, with all the new documents that you need for everything, with all the paper money being printed, the price of paper certainly has to go up because the demand is there. European equities rose and peripheral bond yields fell on Friday on growing expectations of ECB action to bring down Spanish and Italian borrowing costs, but concerns about possible German opposition to such a move kept risk appetite in check. Eurozone governments and the European Central Bank are preparing to intervene on financial markets, according to the French daily Le Monde, citing unnamed sources. A day after ECB President Mario Draghi boosted risk assets across the globe with his pledge to do whatever it takes within the bank's mandate to defend the single currency, now all of a sudden everybody thinks he's going to start printing. He's backed himself into a corner. If he doesn't come up with anything, then he could be in trouble, according to a strategist at Knight Capital. And once again, I've done you a dirty deed and cut you off, but we'll let you give your thoughts on this when we come back in about 5 minutes. This is David Finzer with Ollie Neville for Truth and Lies Radio. Stay tuned. We'll keep on talking about the bank printing. This is David Finzer with Truth and Lies Radio on Threatening Thursday, where we're talking about the European Union. I'm joined with my European co-host via electronic transmission from the UK, Ollie Neville. We were talking about the ECB printing money just before we had to break for a commercial, and now, Ollie, it's your turn to sound off.
Well, the ECB really has forced itself to act and backed itself into a corner here. It didn't need to make any comments. Mario Draghi didn't need to make any comments. And now he has. People are expecting action. And today we've seen he hasn't really acted in any decisive way to calm markets. And he's, the Italian bonds have risen to 6.3%. Spain's have risen to 7.2%. But the point still is that he will and is planning to print lots of money. He's going to completely, without any democratic control, without any acceptance of the people of Europe or even the governments of Europe. And the ECB is starting to do now what the nations of Europe are very unwilling to do, and that's to instigate transfers. You know, the whole fear of the German people when they joined the EU was it would become a transfer union where with the sort of the richer north bailing out the less productive southern countries. And now with ECB printing money, it's hitting the savers and the hard workers in countries like Finland or Germany, and it's bailing out the Spanish, the Greeks, the Italians that basically got into, that used the Eurozone boom to get into huge amounts of debt that they thought they'd never have to pay off. And now they're in a position where they can't afford anything unless the ECB buys bonds. So the ECB is just printing money to buy bad debt, and the only way this Eurozone project is staying together is by them printing limitless money, and it's just going to cause huge inflation down the line, huge problems for Europe. They're storing the problem up, really, and kicking the can down the road.
Well, it seems to me what they're doing is almost inevitably creating a Eurozone-wide situation that's going to rival the Weimar Republic, where the euro is going to be worth nothing.
Well, absolutely. That's why the Germans in the ECB and generally have been very worried about this. They keep saying, you don't print this money. People have to learn to live within their means. You can't just keep on bailing people out for being feckless and spending so much. And German ministers from the ECB have resigned, saying that they, in disgust at previous attempts to print money, and they just steamroll over them. And the Germans learned from the Weimar Republic that if you print all this money, you just devalue, and make everything worthless. And they haven't learnt the lessons of history. And those people, that don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Correct. And no one is going to believe they're not going to print money, because every time they say you've got to live within your means, and then someone calls them on it, calls their bluff, they go ahead and print the money and continue to devalue the currency, and that affects the whole continent.
Oh, absolutely. There's no credibility in ECB threats. They've said that they're going to bail out every bank, that no bank will be allowed to fail, no country will be allowed to fail as well. So they're trying to give at the moment, they're trying to force Spain to give up its sovereignty and accept a direct bailout. They've already bailed out Spanish banks. They're just going to keep on printing, buying bonds, and because it's not for them about economic reality. It's a dream. It's a European project, and they just ignore reality to carry on their United States of Europe dream, and it's just not going to work.
So the Fourth Reich is going to start out bankrupt. Well, anyway, so it sounds though like the UK hasn't learned either, according to some other news you sent me. There's a new UK lending scheme, and remember, in America that means just plan. A new plan to prompt banks and other lenders to make more money available to homeowners and businesses has come into operation. Obviously, the UK didn't watch what happened with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Under the Funding for Lending initiative, the Bank of England will lend money at below market rates to financial institutions. The bank will then monitor their progress in lending the cash out. Some mortgage lenders have already cut the cost of their long-term fixed-rate deals. Now, what's this going to do to your country?
Well, this is again just idiocy from the UK government. Cheap loans caused this financial crisis. It was government action forcing companies to give cheap loans that was the problem. And instead of now realizing that, letting the market, bring back, settle at equilibrium, they're just trying to push people to give out more cheap loans, lend more money. And the problem is that all the things they do, they're giving cheap loans to banks, with their bailouts originally, they're basically backing up these big corporatist banks, very few banks. And what we really need is real banking competition. Here in Britain recently we had a documentary called Bank of Dave about this guy who was trying to set up his own bank because he wanted to go back to the good old days when people would know their bank manager, and you'd assess someone before you gave them a loan, and you do proper sensible banking. And he found that the number of regulations by the Financial Services Authority and the Bank of England meant that it was almost impossible for him to set up a bank. We haven't had a new bank in England for over 100 years because it's just the barriers to entry caused by the government mean that no one can set it up. And if you don't have competition, then you just get these banks that are A, too big to fail, B, they don't compete with each other because there's no incentive to. It's much more profitable to sort of collude. So what we've really got is a corporatist system failing, the government trying to pump in more money, cheap money, which caused the problem. Where the UK is already in huge amounts of debt, our real national debt, looking back past the government statistics and including things like pension liabilities, we're on something like £8 trillion. That's 600% of GDP is debt. And we're just throwing more money at these banks. It just defies logic. And
the big banks are awfully crooked. I mean, HSBC got which is London headquartered, even though it's Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, got the biggest fine Mexico has ever given for money laundering. Now think about how bad the operation has to be for Mexico to fine a bank for money laundering.
Oh, absolutely. The whole sort of cozy consensus of these banks, they're all massively corporatist, and it's not a failure of capitalism having these banks. It's a failure of a corporatist system that allows these big banks to grow, and then the government is in their pockets, and they do, whenever they ask, they come running, they throw more money at them, they bring in more regulations to stop competition, and these banks get huge bailouts. They're part-owned, some of them part-owned by the British government. Their top executives get massive salaries, huge bonuses, even when they're making giant losses, and there's no competition to make them cut costs, because they've sort of stacked the decks in their favour, because they've got the government on side.
Well, with only 2 minutes left, we all know how the banks are bad, so let's move on to EU emission trading plan. The U.S. is hosting a 2-day meeting of countries opposed to the EU's controversial carbon tax on airlines. Delegates meeting at the U.S. Department of Transportation in Washington, D.C. are exploring an alternative global solution that would include the EU. China, India, Russia, and the U.S. are among the countries opposed to the U.S. plan, which took effect on the EU plan, which took effect on 1 January. The U.S. says the EU's unilateral action could lead to a patchwork system if other countries impose their own tax. Now, what's so bad about a patchwork system? I'm not so sure. Of course, I don't think any of this emission trading is really a very good idea.
Well, no, the emission trading scheme, it just goes to show the incompetence of the EU and Brussels, is that they can't even get their scheme to work. In the last phase, the first phase of this scheme, trading permits dropped to 10 cents per ton. Absolutely no incentives to cut CO2. Obviously, something I was glad about, but they're so incompetent they can't calculate things. These permits give massive windfall profits to big companies that just get given these schemes and then can sell them on. All the costs are passed on to the consumer. Increasing big companies' profits even more. There's barely any carbon cutting, which is their aim, as misguided as that is. But there's huge amounts of again, corporatism. It's just ridiculous. And what's more, it's going to apply to planes soon. The US and China have blocked their airlines from it being affected by it. So all it does is make EU companies less competitive, and so everyone's obviously just going to move to American companies. You can't act in this individually, because then people just move. It's like with the Robin Hood tax. If you do it alone, people just leave you.
Unfortunately, Ollie, you're going to have the last word because we've run out of time. So I'll tell everybody, as I always do, remember, you only have 3 choices. Give in and live like a serf, fight back until you can't stand it anymore, or get out and take your freedom with you. This is David Finzer with Ollie Neville for Truth and Lies Radio. We'll see you tomorrow when Ollie will be back.